Hi guys, my name's Maddie. Just as a little introduction, this whole court case is about a class action lawsuit in Southern California in the 1940s. Our whole exhibit is put on by Modal, but we have a few rules before we start. First of all, we're really excited to have you guys here. Second, the exhibit is pretty fragile, so please don't touch anything. We will give you opportunities to touch things and it'll be interactive, but until then, try not to touch anything. Everything's really fragile. Second of all, if you have phones, please turn them off, keep them in your pockets. We don't want you guys to disrupt anybody else within the exhibit. Third, if you have to use the restroom, it's right over here. And please let your teacher or supervisor know before you leave. And lastly, please don't leave the exhibit of the library. As of right now, I'm in charge of you guys, so if you leave, I get in trouble. So keep where I can see you and don't go anywhere beyond where you're supposed to. Hi guys, my name's Maddie. Before we get started, I just want to thank you guys for coming. We're really happy to have you guys here. This whole exhibit is about a court case that happened in Southern California in the 1940s, and it's put on by Modal. So again, we're really happy to have you guys here, and we're really excited.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a class action lawsuit. The lawsuit we're going to be talking about is Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Now, a class action lawsuit is something maybe you guys don't know yet, but it's basically when you take someone to court and you're with a group of other people like you. So Mendez et al. Is accompanied by 5 families, and Westminster School District et al. Is accompanied by 4 school districts. The whole case is based on desegregating schools in California because there was a difference in how both schools, which were American and Mexican schools, were educating their students. So our 5 families, who are Guzman, Ramirez, Estrada, Mendez, and Palomino, are going to be facing off against Westminster School District, Santa Ana School District, El Morena School District, and Garden Grove School District. So both of those, both of the schools and the 5 families are going to be going to court to fight for whether desegregation should be allowed in California or if the schools should be separated. And with a class action, the reason why we need all of these group members is because we're stronger in a group. For example, if I gave you 1 pencil, you probably should be able to snap that. It's not that hard. But if I were to give you 10 pencils and ask you, hey, can you snap both of these, all of these at the same time, it gets a little harder. So that's why we needed these 5 families to come together for this case.
Rolling.
So here we're going to be talking about how life was for Mexicans in California. So we're going to be talking about the 30s and 40s. During this time, globally, we were seeing World War II. And because of World War II, a lot of Americans were going over to the European and Pacific theater to partake in the war, leaving a lot of jobs open. And while a lot of women could do factory work, there were still other jobs that needed people to work them. And some of these jobs were field work, something Orange County is known for because of the orange groves. So a lot of immigrants from south of the border were coming up to take these jobs and try to make sure that they were worked and be able to send money back home, as there was also other events happening south. So because they were coming up to take orange field work, they weren't coming over exactly to own the fields, but just to make sure that the oranges were picked and they were packed. Men would be focused on picking the oranges. They had to make sure that every orange was cut a precise way in order to be rehired. And they had to fill big bags of oranges that would amount to about 50 pounds while they were going to bring them up. While they were bringing them down. Bringing them up would be empty bags, and they'd bring down the 50 pounds of oranges. Then those pounds of oranges would be taken back to packing houses. And in packing houses, the women would be working, making sure that each of those oranges would be able to go into a crate in a specific pattern and a specific style, because the owners of the packing houses wanted to make sure that they could go over to vendors in a perfect manner. That also meant that they had to make sure that each orange looked nice and that it doesn't look bruised or ugly, because if there was an orange that was slipped in that didn't look nice, or maybe the pattern wasn't correct, then that crate was considered not actual work, and the women wouldn't be paid for that kind of work ethic. So these packing houses had similar rules to what you might see in a classroom. The women were not allowed to speak or talk. They couldn't sing with their fellow workers, and they had to make sure they were completely focused on their work. Now, additionally to that, something you might see in your classrooms is that you're allowed to sit while you work. But a lot of these women had to be standing up during the long hours that they're working. So both the men and women are going to be busy. And then additionally to that, we also have 8 to 9-year-old boys who would be running down trees picking up oranges that fell. They would be called ratas because of the way they scurry down trees. That would happen if adult men weren't able to put all of the oranges they picked into their bags correctly, and a few would slip out. So that's why the boys would come in handy to be able to get those oranges in. They are, after all, still products that could be sold. But for the women, there wasn't a lot of girls working in the packing house or in the fields. They would be working back home, making sure that their siblings were dressed or that the house stayed clean, that food was ready. Because a lot of these families are going to be working for long hours. And they're working for long hours because they get paid about $2 a day. Now, today, that would be about $30. And that's still not enough for the long hours they were working, because California today pays us $15 as the minimum wage. So 2 hours for me would be $30. 2 hours for them would not be $30. And that's not fair considering the hard work that they're putting in to this type of environment. So as I talked about in the last panel, we were talking about how workers were only getting about $2 a day, $30 today. And this kind of reflects back to the community. If we look over here, we can see that Mexican communities had probably not the best houses that you would think to buy first, and the roads weren't really paved, so you still had a lot of dirt and a lot of mud. It's something that maybe if you come from countries like Mexico or the Philippines, I've had people tell me that we have our roads like this, and I have seen in Mexico that we do as well. So this is just a reflection of how much the money wasn't really flowing into the community. And that meant that a lot of Mexicans would have to figure out ways to be able to save money. Now, so maybe saving money for Students' Day would be maybe don't buy those chips in the store or don't get that piece of candy that you wanted. But for these families, a lot of saving money was about making sure that you were able to save food costs in other areas. Like maybe you could get a goat for dairy, or maybe get some chickens and you have some eggs ready. Easier methods were making sure you had a fruit or vegetable garden available so that you didn't have to spend money on produce. And then there was other ways to spend less money on your clothing, maybe your flour bags that you finished using, that tela, that fabric, could be later on used to create a dress, maybe curtains, maybe tablecloth. It was, if you had a needle and some thread, you could practically do anything with some fabric that you had lying around. And of course, we could always use hand-me-downs from other families. So that's how the community stayed strong through maybe not the best economic stability. So while the community didn't have a lot of money coming in, they were still able to stay strong through a lot of social events. Church was very important for a lot of Mexicans, so maybe you could go to a first communion, baptism, a wedding, and there's also other events like making sure you celebrate your country's Independence Day. Remember, these are immigrants, so they don't necessarily celebrate the American Independence Day only. And then there's also sporting events that you could go. And all of these kind of events were able to keep your ties stronger so that you had a sense of community and you had people to rely on. And it's very important to have people to rely on during this time because we are seeing segregation popping up almost everywhere in the country. And in California specifically, segregation was meant to separate American and Mexican communities. So segregation is when you're separated into groups based on maybe ethnicity, nationality, something that you can't control, or another element about who we are. And in Mexican and American communities, it would be about skin color or maybe last name or language we speak. So in restaurants, if you went, there might be a Mexican only sign, or there may be a no Mexicans allowed sign right next to a no dogs allowed sign. So you kind of start to understand how they had to deal with what American people thought of them. And another sign of this is cases like Alex Bernal. Now, Alex Bernal was a Mexican who was able to afford a home in Fullerton, and he did so, and he bought himself a very nice house in a very nice neighborhood, but this neighborhood was filled with a lot of American people, and they couldn't understand how a Mexican was able to afford such a nice house and why he would live with them. They wanted to have a clear separation. They wanted to keep him segregated into his type of colonies. So Alex Bernal was they were trying to push him out. Thankfully, Alex Bernal was able to get help from a civil case lawyer called David Marcus, who we're going to see more of a little later, because he became very important in making sure that Mexicans had rights during their time in California. So we were talking earlier about segregation, and there is actually two different types of segregation. So we have de facto and de jure segregation. De facto is something you might be a little more familiar with. It's something that we all kind of do without really thinking about it. It's when you separate yourself into groups based on something you find similar with the other group or something that you want to be included in. So think back to lunch and recess. During lunch and recess, you either go with groups that are the band kids or the art kids or maybe the soccer kids, and in recess you do it as well. There are kids who play hopscotch, handball, the swing sets. All of these are going to have different little groups going around to join in with the activity. So that would be de facto. We're choosing to go into those little groups by ourselves. And in de jure, we're seeing something else. We're seeing an authority figure telling us that we have to separate into groups. So think about your teachers and maybe your parents. Then above that, we also have governmental officials. Those are people who are in charge of maybe school systems and your other areas that maybe you're not that familiar with yet. So these people are going to be telling you that you have to separate into different groups. And as I said earlier, it's going to be based on something about our character, ethnicity, nationality. They're all fair game, and they're usually the most common reasons why we're separated into groups, why we're segregated. So you're going to see this happening in 30s and 40s California, and as I said earlier, restaurants will have Mexicans only areas or no Mexicans allowed signs. And then we also start to see something similar to maybe water fountains. If you guys remember, if maybe you guys have seen pictures of this in your classrooms, there are the whites only and blacks only water fountains that you sometimes learn about when we talk about 30s and 40s and a little bit further. So whites only water fountains, they're it's very obvious that they look cleaner. You trust the water. They look like somebody's making sure that it's taken care of. Blacks only, it looks rusty. It's maybe not the best water source that you immediately want to go drink out of. And that kind of throws you off a bit because it looks very obviously that's very different. And you start seeing this with Mexican and American schools in California, which is an example of de jure segregation by law. So Mexicans only schools are going to be your blacks only water fountains. American schools are going to be your whites only water fountains. Your American schools are going to have the new textbooks with updated information, teachers who are willing to help you out, teachers who are being paid as they should be. You have playground equipment that is just shinier, and you're also, more importantly, being prepared for higher education. So you're going to be sent off to college, and they're making sure that you're prepared to start studying in college. Now, Mexican schools are very different, not only because they're getting secondhand textbooks and their teachers aren't being paid the same rate that they should be, but because they're being taught a very different curriculum to what the American students are being taught. Now, Mexican students, they aren't going to be prepared for college. They're not going to be prepared for higher education because that time frame is going to be spent Americanizing the students and making sure that they fit into their new country. So that means that they need to be taught how to speak English. That means forgetting Spanish and forgetting your culture. And that's going to be very difficult because not all of these Mexican students are actually Mexican. Some of them are from Honduras, Bolivia, Peru, Chile maybe. If it's south of the border, South America, Central America, it counts as Mexican during this time because they spoke Spanish, they had Spanish last names, and skin tones would also be indicators of your Mexican heritage. Something similar goes on in Florida, but instead of Mexicans, it's Puerto Ricans. So we're focusing on California, where it's Mexicans. So Mexican students are being told to forget about their culture. They can't talk about it. So you're not really explaining who you actually are, and you're not being able to speak Spanish either. You have to be perfect English. Another part of Americanization is making sure that you are healthy and you have manners, because it's believed that Mexicans aren't healthy and don't have manners. And a big reason for that is because their Mexican customs are very different from your American customs. And Americans, when they saw stuff like eating tacos with our hands, they thought, well, that's not the right way to eat your food. You need to use utensils. And they tried to Americanize a very Mexican food style. And that is why they believed that manners and health needed to be taught in order to be Americanized properly. So before you enter class, you have to make sure your hands are clean. That means also checking under your nails. And you have to make sure to listen to the teacher when she says you need a shower. So that would mean look to the board, and if you see your name on the board, that's your teacher telling you you need to take a shower. Maybe you guys usually see your name on the board and think, oh, I'm in trouble, or she wants to talk to me, or maybe I got a good grade, but for them, it was automatically, for sure, teacher thinks I need a shower. So that was part of Americanization. And the other part was making sure that they weren't going to college, but were prepared to go into hard labor jobs, which meant field work, shoemaking, we have an example here, blacksmithing. You had to make sure that Mexican students were being prepared for this kind of work, because it wasn't thought that they could be suitable for college level work. They thought there's no real way that they're going to be able to go over there, so we should at least prepare them for what is more understandable for them. Housekeeping was another thing that was very common. And this wasn't very fair, and 5 families noticed that their students weren't really being taught what they needed to be taught in the Mexican schools, because their students wanted to be teachers, doctors. They had dreams that involved going to college, and they tried going to American schools to help admit them into those schools, but those schools weren't being very helpful. So as we're going to see later on, 5 families decided to do something about this injustice. I talked about earlier about how Mexican and American schools were different, and this slide basically goes over how these differences would have appeared. We have a class of students here, but underneath we also have pictures of each type of school. So on the third picture, we can see that this is a solid brick building built in 1928, because older Mexican schools were wooden framed. And it's just an example of the kind of differences we're going to see in our school systems and how they're prepared for students. Some of these students don't have shoes, and you can see how maybe 1 in 25 students would decide to go further in school, and the other rest won't decide to go further in school. There are just more opportunities available in working than there would be in education. But like I said, 5 families noticed that their children really did want to go, and they noticed that they really deserved. So that's what we'll be focusing on from now on. So as I said, there were 5 families that looked at the injustice that was happening with Mexican and American schools and decided to do something about it. And this led to the class action lawsuit, as we said earlier, Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Now, this is actually a pretty long named court case, because if I were to say the whole name, it would be Guzman Ramirez Estrada Mendez Palomino versus Westminster School District and Modena School District, Santa Ana School District, and Garden Grove School District. Now, that's a lot of names, and I don't really like having to say all of that every time I have to bring this court case up. And a lot of people sort of agree. So et al. Is added on to the other names, so that we know that there are more people involved in this case that are just as important to what happened with it, but we want to shorten it just to be able to say it quicker or write it down quicker. It doesn't mean that the other 5 families weren't as important or that the other school districts weren't as important. It just means that we need to save time, and et al. Is Latin for and all, so it should be inclusive enough for everything to be added. These 5 families had to work hard to make sure that they were able to go up against these school districts. They had to plan hard with their lawyer, David Marcus, the person who helped out Alex Bernal on one of the previous slides. And petitions were signed by 5 families to go to other families who also agreed that, hey, we need to see some sort of change. And so Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Began in 1945 when finally both sides finally went up against each other in court to decide which side the judge would side with. So let me explain how a court case works. In a court case, we have our plaintiffs and our defendants. Plaintiffs are coming in with a sort of complaint. They want to change something. And defendants are the people whose position they want to change. They want to tell defendants that they need to do something different or something should be done that they had already done. You understand the gist? Plaintiffs are coming in with the complaint, plaintiffs, and defendants are defending what is already existing. So for this case, our 5 families are plaintiffs and our school districts are defendants. Now both sides have lawyers, so both sides have people who are gathering information and making sure that each side is thoroughly has support for whatever they're trying to do. And for our plaintiffs, our 5 families, what they're trying to do is make sure that schools are desegregated so that Mexican students can go into American schools to get that American education, which will help them get to college. Defendants are trying to make sure that segregation stays in place because they believe it is very necessary. So plaintiffs are supporting their belief in desegregation by saying our students are falling with a lot of self-esteem issues, they're not really being prepared for college as they should be, and they're not even really learning how to be American. They're having faults in their English learning and they're losing their identity, such as our culture and our language. And defendants are trying to say, well, we need segregation put up because our American students shouldn't have to fail or get less attention put on them because teachers are going to be helping out Mexican students try to be integrated into this new school. And each side went back and forth with these type of issues. In 1945, a judge actually sided with the plaintiffs and said, no, they're right, the students deserve to be able to go to American schools. But the defendants were not happy with that. They did not like to know that they would have to desegregate their schools, so they went over to a higher appeal court, which is somewhere you can go to get a second opinion from another judge. And in 1947, that second judge agreed with the plaintiffs that schools should be desegregated so that students could be able to get that higher education they deserve. So let's remember that this is not a Mexican versus American case. This is a desegregation versus segregation case because both sides would have, the plaintiffs are 5 families, they would still have Americans supporting desegregation and defendants would still have Mexicans supporting segregation. So this is a desegregation versus segregation court case that was won in 1947 on the side of desegregation. So as I said, in 1947, schools were desegregated all across California, but it was only for California. We wouldn't see a major nationwide change until Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education was finally all types of schools had to be desegregated throughout the whole of the United States. So in California, with Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al., we saw Mongolian schools, Korean schools, Native American schools, and Mexican schools. If you had a different ethnicity or nationality, there's a good chance you had a different school to fit you in. And all of those schools had to desegregate. And so it was until Brown versus the Board of Education where we saw those schools desegregate completely. Brown versus the Board of Education was obviously monumental to education in today's world. And a lot of its basis came from Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. There was people who were working on the case and people who were watching the case closely in order to be able to inspire them or to use some of the basis. For example, Brown versus the Board of Education, a big thing that helped them out was self-esteem issues, showing how different groups were falling down with their self-esteem because of the segregation they were experiencing. And remember that we hit that on Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. With Health and Manners. That was a big part that plaintiffs were playing up to be able to show that this school separation was not working out. So thanks to Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al., we got Brown versus the Board of Education, and now we have entire schools made out of very diverse faculty and students. You're not going to see just one type of student throughout the whole school now. And that's thanks to this case. And unfortunately, some of the adults who were working on it, the 5 families, they weren't able to see how far-reaching this whole thing was. So they left a legacy of educational opportunity. Of course, it's still kind of unfinished because despite legally being able to go into different schools, a lot of students of color still aren't very ready to enter the schools. You still have students who drop out early, or very few students who actually make it into college or university. So it's important to be able to remind them that we have this opportunity and we should take this. And then we also have still de facto segregation that is still affecting a lot of our schools, where economically some families decide to move their kids into a school they can afford. And that means that a lot of schools have a bigger portion of a certain group, and other schools have a bigger portion of that other group. And this kind of separation is de facto segregation. They're separating themselves. Sometimes we even do it when we want to make sure that we're with people who are like us. So it's important to remember that despite the huge legacy Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Left behind, we can still do our part to make sure that we continue the legacy ourselves. Thanks to the educational opportunity legacy that Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Case left behind, we have other people who are leaving behind just as important legacies for other people to follow. We have Ellen Ochoa, a director of NASA Johnson Space Center. Remember how a lot of Mexicans were expected to go into field work, and now we're going into space. So we want to make sure to tell kids about how important and how cool these kind of legacies are that people are leaving behind. We've got Cesar Caballero, Dean of Libraries for California State University of San Bernardino. We've got other legacies over here as well with Mary H. Murguia, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, Dr. Filipa Strum, author of Mendez versus Westminster School Desegregation and Mexican-American Rights in 2010. All of these people are able to do this kind of work and are able to leave these legacies behind thanks to Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. And we can see how much it branches out later on and how they will inspire future generations just as they were inspired for someone before them. During the 30s and 40s, separate but equal was instated into our public facilities. So if you went to schools and if you went to get water at a water fountain or maybe go on the train, you're going to be seeing a separate facility for each type of group. So maybe you've seen the most famous pictures that are blacks only and whites only water fountains. That's an example of separate but equal. As long as each group has a sort of facility available to them that is equal, then it is completely legal and they are allowed to implement that. Of course, though, in the 30s and 40s, we're beginning to see that a lot of these institutions and facilities are not actually as equal as they're being promoted as. And that's what a lot of people are beginning to start to fight against, and that's what civil rights groups are focusing on. David Marcus is an important civil case lawyer that is helping out a lot of the Mexican community try to win back their civil rights. Most notably, he became known to the 5 families of Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Case through the Alex Bernal case, where Alex Bernal needed help to stay in his Fullerton neighborhood because a lot of his American neighbors were trying to kick him out. So David Marcus was able to step in and help him, and later on, the 5 families began to look for him to try and get him with their case. Now, Mendez and Ramirez were the first ones to contact him and try to see what he could do for them because they wanted to desegregate public schools in California. And David Marcus agreed to help them pro bono with no charge. And his first advice was to make sure that they had support from a larger group, which leads into a class action lawsuit. And Mendez and Ramirez later on connected with the families Estrada and Palomino, as well as Guzman, to make sure that they had enough support for their eventual case. Other testimonies were also included. The judge, Paul McCormick, was an important part of the Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Case's success. He was the judge that finalized the decision that the plaintiffs, who are our 5 families, were correct, and they were right in saying that schools should be desegregated. Now, at first, Judge McCormick did not understand how the segregated schools could affect students as much as the plaintiffs were trying to say. But through the course of the court case, they were able to win him over, and he agreed with them, and finally was able to decide that, yes, schools needed to desegregate because there was a racial disparity and an inequality being seen in how they were being taught, and this shouldn't have been supported by law. And it's one of the first cases where a judge stands up against the separate but equal amendment, or the separate but equal stature that the country had previously. Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Involved 5 families. Despite not all of them being named in the court case name, they are all equally important to the success of the eventual case. So we have our Guzman, Ramirez, Estrada, Mendez, and Palomino families. Each of these were already socially connected with each other and had already formed connections through family or friends, such as the Mendez family and the Estrada family. They were connected through Mendez's brother marrying somebody from the Estrada family, and the Palomino family was already close family friends with the Guzman family. Now, Ramirez and Guzman started to become more active in the court case because they had a lot of other friends who were already civil rights advocates. All of this accumulated into all 5 families beginning to know each other and learn each other and connect, and then decide to take on the 4 school districts in Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Here we can give you an insight on how life was back in the 30s and 40s. As you can see, there are images of school children posing for a picture. There's the school being photographed. There's children outside with a goat. And then there's also these children over here that are playing American football. It's a game that even we play right now currently, and it's a game that they played as well and back then, because we are more like them and they are more like us than we think. The Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Involved families who had a lot of relatives or knew a lot of community members who were part of the orange field workers. So these type of workers would be going out making sure that orange fields were picked of their oranges and that they were later packed in. This is an actual artifact donated by the families for the exhibition. So while men would be picking the oranges and making sure that each one was clear cut, the women would be packing them into neat rows and making sure that each of them was lovely enough to be able to be shipped off to whoever was buying them from the field owner. And over here we can see an activity where we want people guessing how much this bag weighs. So this burlap sack is not one that they probably would have used, and this weight is not actually a weight that they probably would have felt, because this is only 10 pounds, and the workers, who were the men who had to pick oranges and put their oranges into the sacks, they would be carrying around 50 pounds. This is only a portion of what that would be, and it's very impressive to many people who might have difficulty picking this up as I just did. This is going to be a portion to give you an idea of what daily life was like for the children in schools and probably for the court cases. As you can see, we still have the I don't know what those are called.
Paddle.
These.
Oh, a gavel.
Oh, we still have the gavel. in school rooms for the school children, 30s and 40s, we didn't have technology that we have today. And while technology does include the computers kids usually use or the phones kids have available to them, it also includes ballpoint pens. Back then we had to use quills and an inkwell in order to make sure that we could write with ink, and in order to make that ink last, we had to use the Palmer method, which is similar to the cursive method, where you have to connect each letter so that your ink doesn't run out on you. It was something that was really taught to those children, and that's how they learned instead of the method we use now. There's also corporal punishment or punishment in schools. This is actually a cricket bat, but in schools, when you saw this, it meant you were about to get punished. So what happens is that you do something you're not supposed to, and the teacher gets mad, sends you over to the principal's office, and the principal is in charge of usually whacking you on your behind or on your knees to make sure that you learn that that kind of behavior is not acceptable. Now, if you ever got the decision between this paddle here or the paddle with holes, it's probably better to choose the paddle without holes because it would go a little slower, and the one with holes would go so fast it would be a lot more of a stronger sting. Now, that's all because of wind resistance, but both of them are used in schools. And then an additional punishment is the soap method. So today, if you think about soap being used in classroom, it's probably for washing hands. But when we go to punishment, you probably think, oh, okay, well, if you say a bad word, if you cuss, then you're going to get your mouth washed out with soap, which is a popular saying in America. But for Mexican schools, what would happen is that if you were speaking Spanish or if you said an English word wrong, you would get your mouth cleaned out with soap to try and encourage students that they're supposed to be speaking perfect English. And this type of punishment, and as well as the paddle punishment, are still allowed in about 19 states in the U.S. So Judge Paul McCormick was a very important part of the Mendes-Doral versus Westminster School District et al. Case. He's the judge who sided with the plaintiffs, our 5 families, and helped them win over the court and make sure that they got the desegregation in schools that they were searching for. And before that, he actually had no idea why they were so insistent that schools needed to be desegregated. He needed to be convinced. And so our plaintiffs, our 5 families, Guzman, Ramirez, Estrada, Mendez, and Palomino, were putting up their own evidence in order to be used in the case. Defendants, who are our 4 school districts, Santa Ana and Modena Garden Grove, they were the ones who, Santa Ana and Modena Garden Grove and Westminster, they were the ones defending why segregation should be kept in school. And he was listening to both sides. In this activity, we helped the kids understand what it would have been like to be in Judge Paul McCormick's seat. You have quotes being read out by Mary Hughes. Segregation, by its very nature, is a reminder constantly of inferiority, of not being wanted, of not being part of the community. And then the students simply decide, who would have said this? The 5 families or our 4 school districts? And they themselves could come into a conclusion, and then later we can explain, after seeing everybody's cards, who would have said this and why that would have been useful for them in court.